Yes, hello, I warmly welcome you, as always. Today on May 3rd, 2026, we are now in the 5th year, and this is day 69 since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. A warm welcome to the Situation Report. In today's report, we'll cover several topics during this live stream. Yes, we need live streams now. We have to work on our reach, and this works best with this format. For that, you have the big advantage of a question and answer session, and we'll see in a moment how that works. But I have the pleasure of introducing someone else to you. You won't see me this time. I'm usually masked on your screen. I'm still working toward a certain position, so it's helpful not to always be recognized in public. All of this will play out over the next few weeks or months. Take a look. Thank you very much for the channel membership. I can see that right here in the stream. You're making a great contribution to the channel. And welcome to the Algo crew. And what I was getting at is we have some, changes. For one thing, there's a program you can see here. If you simply enter the hashtag FrayG in the live chat this time, you'll be able to add a question afterward. So basically, hashtag FrayG, then type your question. It will then be displayed to me just like here. Yes, they'll all be listed here for me. You know something similar. It's similar with Thorsten Herrlich. Questions will appear here for me. You can rank them. And if you find any especially important, just move them up so I can mark them as answered. That's a lot easier than before when everything was done through Discord. Exactly. But I can show you something else. As I mentioned, you can't see me on camera now because some viewers didn't like it when I was on camera speaking. It's a bit awkward. I have a better option. The channel. You can see my mascot yourself down here in the bottom left of the picture. Of course, it supports the two moderators here in the chat for aesthetic reasons. That's why I'd say we won't keep you waiting for too long. Let's get started and take another look at the map. Let's see what has happened in the past. And I see channel memberships are being gifted here. That's crazy. But I wouldn't expect anything else from this community. After all, you are the best community there is. By the way, speaking of the best community again, there is an AI on YouTube. It's in the YouTube Studio section. And this AI analyzes your own videos and content and also compares them with others. Actually, it's general and also tailored to your own channel. And recently I asked what performs really well on the channel. And I was actually referring to topics. And the AI said that the Algo crew is one of the strongest assets on this channel. You can give yourselves a pat on the back. You're present under every video. You're the best and you know it. I'm glad you're here again, and I see lots of channel members. Everything's great. So let's take another look. I'd say let's start with this. It's a pretty interesting video I found, because sometimes innovation doesn't come from new technology, but from improvisation. We can see that on both sides. The Russians have demonstrated strong improvisational skills, and I mean that positively. On the Ukrainian side, we also see much improvisation born of necessity. One example of this is the modified BTM-3 engineering vehicle, which was used by soldiers of the Ukrainian 28th Mechanized Brigade. It has been given a completely new task. Originally, this vehicle was developed to quickly dig trenches. And the technology behind it is based on an older Soviet design, including components from the chassis of the T-54, but instead of moving earth, it serves a completely different purpose. Through targeted modifications and a lot of initiative, the machine was adapted so that it can lay barbed wire quite quickly, effectively, and above all, efficiently, under conditions where manual labor would hardly be possible. This also clearly shows, among other things, how the requirements in the field are changing, because what was originally intended for a completely different task suddenly becomes a practical solution for current problems. And that looks very sensible in practice and is definitely more reasonable than how the other side is still using the T-54 as a battle tank. This is what the whole thing looks like, again, in a side view. So here we see 3 rolls of concertina wire, in this case, which are simply laid down here. Here we see a very interesting construction. 2 side by side, 1 on top. One of the more effective ways to build exactly this kind of wire obstacle. Ukraine is mostly building along the Dnipro line, which is about here. For example, it runs northwest of Pokrovsk, so in this area here. And along this line here, a lot has been built up. There are basically anti-tank ditches there, and then there are more anti-tank ditches again. Then there are protective embankments and what I call baby dragon's teeth, so basically lighter dragon's teeth that weren't set into the ground, but were more or less just brought there and placed. And then they're connected by a steel cable, or maybe it's actually a wire mesh. And you can see exactly these kinds of things there very often, like this spiked wheel here, which is of course quite funny. It's not even meant anymore for infantry to get caught in it like back in the First World War, or to block paths. It's there to, well, how should I put it, channel the enemy's movements. That means the Ukrainians are building defensive lines that are very, very hard to overcome, and are mainly defending them with drones. And where do they defend them? In certain gaps they've left open. They need those themselves, otherwise they'd cut off their own troops. We can see that here as well. So if the defensive line runs here, and if it were completely closed, then Ukrainian troops from Rudinsk, for example, wouldn't be able to get to the rear area anymore. They would be cut off, and that would obviously be bad. There are always one or two openings, and these openings need to be defended. For the defense itself, that's obviously a good thing. You need very few forces to defend a very small area. For the Russians, it has the advantage that they have an area where they don't have to fight so hard or need such great engineering capabilities to be able to climb it. That means these areas are very important for both sides. They bring their own advantages, but of course you also have to say they come with their own disadvantages as well. And that's exactly what they're focusing on. With such barbed wire constructions or earthworks, they're trying to channel Russian troops into certain predefined areas. They go there, they attack because it's also the easiest way for them to get through. And yes, that's where the Ukrainians are trying to fight the Russian troops, mainly with drones. And if the Russians do get through, more drones will follow. And if they still manage to get through, there are more minefields, and if they get even further, then they reach the very first line of defense. I just saw a €24 donation. Thank you very much for that. You really support the channel significantly with that. Especially today. I'll explain that again later in the stream. Yes? The necessary one is, of course, at Tuapse. Because at Tuapse, it's burning again, as you can see very clearly here. We see a fire here. Yes, quite central in the facility after several fires that we've seen in the past few days. Of course, you have to ask yourself, well, how many have there been by now? I've reported here almost every day about ongoing or new fires. Well, so far it's like this. May 1st, which is the day this video was made, was the first hit of May, logically. It couldn't have happened earlier, but it's also the fourth hit within 30 days. That's intense. Tuapse, in case you don't know where that is. That's here by the Black Sea. I just saw another €5 donation. Thank you very much for that. That's by the Black Sea. Here it is. There's Tuapse, and there's a very, very important port for the Russians, just as important as Novorossiysk, because the Black Sea Fleet was divided between Novorossiysk and Tuapse. And the last part is right here in the Black Sea Fleet, at the headquarters in Sevastopol. You can see the Easter egg here yourself. Some of you already know it. Here, it actually says Blackless Fleet. There are several Easter eggs hidden on the situation map. You can find them yourself since you have access. Since we reached 20,000 subscribers. And Tuapse is very important. Oil is exported here, but other goods are also imported. A lot of refining takes place here. And that is very important on the Russian side, because this is basically the last station where it's all about money. And if this one fails, then there's simply no money. And they especially need money for the war. And since Russia is not a technology or service-based economy, but rather a raw materials economy, it's obviously essential to be able to ship raw materials. I just saw another €5.99. Thank you very much for that. So what is very important? The facility is on fire again. It's on fire again. It's hard to describe. How can they not manage to defend such an important port? We'll get to that. That was actually a rhetorical question. Let me say thanks again for the €5 donation. I see it right now. Just like the last times, it starts with a small fire. The fire department isn't able to put out this fire. Why aren't they able to? It's not because of any kind of incompetence. No, quite the opposite. The firefighters really are doing the best they possibly can. It's definitely not their fault. But the thing is, a fire like this, as you can see in the background, really requires a lot of manpower. And with Russian fire departments, as far as I could find out, they're not necessarily understaffed. The problem is more the lack of equipment. You can imagine, anyone who's in the fire department will probably know. You can't just show up here and start putting out the fire with small diameter hose lines and 23 vehicles. No, this is really a major incident. A lot is needed here. You also need heavy equipment, which is lacking. Why? Ukrainians have attacked many refineries before, equipment wears out, and there's no new supply. Much of it used to come from the West. What wasn't sourced from the West simply wasn't produced in sufficient quantities. Or the resources are missing, the financial resources. Yes, because war is very expensive, and savings have to be made elsewhere. Sometimes that means cutting back on the fire department or their equipment, because that's not exactly cheap either. Equipment for the fire department is usually very, very expensive. And if this equipment is missing and the Ukrainians still carry out further attacks, then we see in the background a major emergency that can no longer be controlled. So the Russians have too few personnel as well as too little equipment to put out such fires. Exactly. They're in the background. By the way, the Russian resident here is complaining, just like most people in the area around Tuapse, that the situation is simply difficult, to put it that way. You know what difficult means. The fire has spread here again, and the last large part of the facility is still burning. Of course, for the local residents, it's a sign that this war is a bit closer or a bit more impactful than you might think. Yeah. If you don't notice much of the war, that's understandable. Russia is a very big country. Russia is a very diverse country in terms of education and, of course, just like any other country. But I have to say, of course, the flow of information in the press, there are different from, for example, in Western countries that you could compare. And you have to say that if you're not really interested in the war, but just want to know on the side how things are going, you're told that everything is always going well. Everything is great. Hey, we've been winning in Ukraine nonstop for, 1,530 days now. Yeah, then of course it's hard when you see that the refinery is being attacked for the 4th time in 30 days, and you can't go to the beach anymore. More or less, it's burning pretty much everywhere. And of course, that's a sign of, well, simply uncertainty. Yeah, that sums it up pretty well. I don't think this will be the last attack, and I believe there's not much left. Thanks a lot for the €24. I just noticed it in the chat. That really helps the channel a lot. Now, of course, here's the thing. We see Benz again here. And now you might think, hey, it used to be like this too. The Russians have a lot of refineries, especially many in the West. The Ukrainians have attacked one refinery, then another refinery. The viewers who have been around for a while, they know it too. They think, hey, the Ukrainians attacked the refinery back then. 2 days later, it was the other refinery. 2 days after that, it was an oil pumping station. Maybe the next day it was another oil depot, and they were completely scattered. Now we're seeing what I already suspected in the situation report on Thursday. We're seeing a kind of strategic shift that's starting to take shape on the Ukrainian side, especially compared to the last 3 major attacks. We see that the Ukrainians are no longer attacking all the refineries, more or less at the same time. We can see now that the Ukrainians are mainly focusing on refineries and attacking them until they are no longer operational. A refinery is, after all, yes, more or less built up in several processing steps. There is this area where something is refined, and then it goes to the next area, and then the product, or depending on what you want to produce in the end, is further processed. And in the end, you get what you want. If a part of this chain fails, then you can't produce anything there until that part has been replaced. That was the Ukrainians' initial strategy, as attacking key parts of the facility was highly cost-effective. These may only be available in the West or are sanctioned, making them hard for Russians to get. Yes, that may be true, but in a refinery there is usually not just one production line, but 3 or 4 running in parallel, and the Ukrainians then have to hit all of them. If they don't hit a component properly, that's just how it is, and the Russians still get by through improvisation, often sacrificing workplace safety. To produce something usable or to keep operations running at least somewhat. But now it seems that wasn't enough for the Ukrainians, and they're starting to destroy key stations. That's actually very interesting, especially compared to others, because what we're seeing here at Tuapse can't be rebuilt in 2 or 3 months, nor can it be scaled down to a certain capacity so you can keep working. They're destroying it completely until the end. There's also a video taken up close, a video from a firefighter who walks through here through the partially burned sections of the refinery. As I said, we're looking at a total loss. There's pretty much nothing left to save here. Office buildings, oil tanks. Well, what can you say about that? Like I said, there's not much left to save and it's still burning back there. Firefighting has mostly stopped. We see empty fire hoses on the ground, which is about all that's being done now. But as we can see ourselves, in the end, it won't make much of a difference anymore. In this context, by the way, thanks for the €2 in the chat, there's also a new satellite image. This satellite image is not Tuapse. Tuapse is much bigger. We already looked at that recently. That was, of course, just a quick look at the situation report from the last few days. I showed some satellite images there. I actually don't have one right now. But this is an image that, in my opinion, explains the war very well.
Weil?
Because now I'm on the wrong image, sorry. This is the facility near Perm. Yes, as I said, this isn't Hopeset, this is Perm. These are satellite images. It's been burning here for 5 days already. And the facility near Perm still has some fuel tanks back here. They already burned down in the first attack. This was actually the second attack on Perm. So, 5 days ago. Here, it affected these tanks here. In the end, only these 4 up front are still standing. Yes, I think there's a high probability there will be another attack, which will probably focus on these tanks here, since the rest of the facility has already become pretty much unusable. The image I actually wanted to talk about is this one. Also from Perm, in my opinion, it actually explains the war pretty well. In the foreground, we see people in a cemetery. In this cemetery, there's a memorial marked with flowers, displaying the Wagner Group symbol. And that is also a memorial stone or a monument of the Wagner Group, here still with the flag, and also with their logo visible on the stone. Probably relatives or comrades of those who lay flowers here. And in the background, as you can see yourself, a burning refinery. That is quite, I would say, an interesting image that makes the situation of this war quite clear. Yes, there are heavy Russian losses and a population aware of the war. Yet, as seen from the uniforms, there are even uniforms for children here. Yes, we see that. They support this as well, or they are involved or have this military connection, while in the background a refinery is burning, which is only burning because they invaded the neighboring country. You have to imagine that. We can see everything in this picture. As I said, only some profit from this. Those in the front aren't war profiteers. They're the ones who must face the war's consequences. Whether that's good or not, of course, everyone can decide for themselves. But in any case, they have some losses to mourn, which wouldn't exist if they hadn't invaded. And these losses, yes, we can see them here spread out in the background or here on this side, and at the same time, of course, also economic losses in the background. Nevertheless, the economy, especially the war economy, is actually the main beneficiary of this war, and above all, the flower industry. I say that very often. Why the flower industry? Well, see for yourself. I don't need to say much more about that. As sad or as macabre as it may sound. Of course, there are always profiteers in war. Yes, now of course refineries are being attacked, oil depots are being attacked. What can you do about it? The Russian air defense is not able to intercept and cover everything. That's a topic I have for later. Ideas are necessary, of course. So what do you do? If you're not able to protect the people, well, then the people just have to protect themselves. And that brings us to a very interesting article. I uploaded it to Telegram recently. A few words about that. In Russia, a very unusual step is currently being discussed. In the future, companies could be held responsible for their own defense. The trigger is a proposal that comes directly from the State Duma. The deputy Sergei Mironov is demanding that large companies set up their own units to protect themselves against drone attacks. The focus is primarily on energy companies and other strategically important industries. They are supposed to work more closely with the Ministry of Defense and actively contribute to securing their facilities. The background is a new legal regulation that allows private security companies to use small arms to protect critical infrastructure. This has established the legal framework, but now it's about consistently making use of these possibilities. However, Mironov goes a clear step further. For him, it's not nearly enough that companies are allowed to protect themselves. In his opinion, they should be required to do so. The reasoning is supposed to be very clear. Government resources are limited, especially in times of increased security requirements. That's why economically important players also have to take on more responsibility. That would mean a significant shift. Security would then no longer be solely the responsibility of government forces, but also part of the company structure itself. At the same time, the pressure to act quickly is increasing, especially with regard to important political events and the increasing attacks on infrastructure. That's why there's a demand to reduce bureaucratic hurdles and implement protective measures quickly. Two things that are very interesting. On the one hand, you have to say, yes, it does make sense to give companies permission to more or less protect themselves. Yes, I think that's also in the interest of many insurance companies. They can then say, hey, for example, you have to, or also in the interest of many companies, because then they can put together a relatively cheap drone defense team and show the insurance company. For example, hey, look, we're also taking extra steps to protect ourselves. Then it could be that the premiums, which have currently increased due to the drone threat and the recent drone strikes in the past few months, could possibly go down, or there could be some subsidies from the government. On the other hand, it also shows the absolute failure of the state because they are no longer able to protect all their areas here. By the way, thanks for the €2 in the chat. If someone can't protect their people anymore, what should they do? What does that suggest? As a company employee, you now realize the company must handle its own protection because the state, which started the war, can't manage it. You are now in danger at home because the state, which I want to repeat, started this war, can't manage to protect its own facilities. And of course, you could take this far back into the past. You could argue that on the Russian side, such a scenario would never have been conceivable due to absolute naivety, short-sightedness, and other reasons, maybe simply, I'll just say arrogance. Back then, people believed the special operation would last 3 days, maybe 3 weeks at most, and were already planning a victory parade after just 3 days. Of course, with fireworks and everything, and it's hard to reconcile that now with the fact that our own facilities are burning down, on the Russian side, of course. What does the current drone threat actually mean now? So, it's really difficult. Russia is increasingly reaching practical limits in defending against the current attacks. The number of threats is growing, and they're appearing in more and more different places at the same time. So it's not just about attacks on industrial plants, but simply about attacks on, for example, one or another ammunition factory, one or another explosives factory, just like we've seen in the past few days. They're also being drawn into this. And that makes comprehensive defense, of course, unrealistic. Especially in the south, particularly around Tuapse, it becomes especially visible. But the real problem lies much deeper. To protect such a large country simultaneously, at any time and everywhere, requires enormous resources, and those are not available in unlimited supply. That's why a silent competition for priorities arises. What is truly worth protecting? Which systems, which ones should be the focus? and which regions have to make do with less. That decision has consequences. Protection, or rather protection in one place, currently means less protection in another place. That means the Russians have a certain number of anti-aircraft guns or air defense systems. And if they now say, for example, that they are prioritizing one oil port or another more, then this prioritization is simply missing at other oil ports. And even in the political leadership, it seems that the realization is slowly taking hold that there are no longer any completely safe zones. Even central regions can no longer automatically be considered invulnerable. In this context, certain political steps seem less like strength and more like risk management. It's about buying time, reducing pressure, and limiting one's own vulnerability. But the real problem remains. And when you secure key areas, new gaps appear. And it's exactly this dynamic that makes the situation so hard to predict. The defense, on the other hand, has to pool resources and inevitably get spread thinner there. In the end, there's a structural dilemma. The more you try to secure individual key areas, the harder it gets. And that, of course, makes it hard to control. At this point, thanks for the 20 euros. I think we'll reach our goal today. Very cool. Keep it up. You're really helping the channel a lot. As you can see, my dog just disappeared. That's not good for someone running a live stream. And there he is again. Let's talk about the 23 euros. There's some kind of problem with the stream. YouTube has in the past, as you know, demonetized many of my videos because I once showed an explosion or when there was gunfire in them. It's always been really tough for them because they said it doesn't fit with their ad policies. That means I don't get any revenue from the stream. I still had to do the work anyway. With streams, it's always been the case that my streams always get demonetized after just a few seconds, for whatever reason. I always post it again on Telegram so I can vent about it there. At this point, it's really great when people donate here so I don't have to cover the channel costs all by myself. Thank you very much for that. Channel costs, yes, there are a lot of expenses. I gather a lot of information. I draw on a lot of source material. Many of the sources are not free. I pay for them myself with my own money. And yet I still offer you a free report every day. Every day for almost 4 years now. That's why small donations from the community are very, very helpful, because right now it more or less helps to balance things out. So once again, a big thank you to all channel members, especially to Lieutenant Colonel Renike Siladutik Ferdi Meyerhofer. By now I can already say it by heart. But aside from that, apart from the drone attacks, there is another very, very important topic. Take a look at the date. It's almost time. May 9th is getting closer and closer. What's on May 9th? Well, on May 9th, the Russian side celebrates victory in the Great War, or in the Great Patriotic War. By that, they mean the victory over Nazi Germany. That's not a problem by itself. But this parade, as we've seen in recent years, is also being used for propaganda to justify the war of aggression in Ukraine. They also want to somehow present the war in Ukraine as a victory. And that's a problem, because there's no longer a strict separation between the original war, which is what this parade is actually about, and what they've been doing in the meantime. After all, the war in Ukraine isn't the only one. And what does this danger mean now? That's a very interesting video from Peskov. Thanks for the 10 euros, by the way. We can take a look at this clip. It's about the May 9th parade, or about questions. There was a brief interview. You could take a quick look. Yes, you read it yourself. Before I get into that, I saw something in the chat. Channel memberships were gifted. Thanks for that. I saw that Allegriak also got one. I already know many of the viewers just by their usernames. Allegriak is actually one of those people, or actually the one who manages to be the first to comment under almost every video for several years now. Welcome. Glad to have you with us again. I also need to greet some members. Just like Westphal, who is with us, Shorty, and many others I can't name right now because otherwise I'd drag out the stream forever. That would be the exact opposite of this channel's purpose. But let's get to the statement. I'll just call it interesting for now, because the Kremlin has taken a position on several points, and then we saw a statement from this entire interview. And the statement just now gives a pretty good insight into Russia's current line. Or rather the Kremlin's, since the tone on this topic remains clear. Moscow apparently doesn't expect any response from Kiev regarding a possible ceasefire around Victory Day. The message behind it? The decision will be made independently of Kiev's consent. I have to laugh. How's that supposed to work? That's like if Germany, or rather the Third Reich, had simply said during the first retreat battles in World War II, hey, so we've talked a little among ourselves, I mean among us, of course, and we've now unilaterally decided that there will be a ceasefire for a few days. Best regards, the Wehrmacht. Please don't attack for the next few days. Thank you. That's about how it comes across. Of course that's difficult, because how can one side decide on a ceasefire? How can you say it doesn't need the other side's consent? How is that supposed to work? Back to the war in Ukraine again. The decision about a possible ceasefire around May 9th lies solely with Putin. Specific times haven't even been set yet. At the same time, however, Moscow is expecting, or waiting, as Peskov himself added at the very end, for an official response from Kiev. But it wouldn't actually be necessary, since it would only be there to demonstrate a proper intention. So it would be purely symbolic. We can see that in the last sentence here. First he says yes, so a ceasefire. No one else's consent is needed for that. We'll just decide that ourselves. And here it's like, yes, it would be good if they still responded, but it would only be purely symbolic just to show good intentions. Of course, that's difficult to argue. Apart from this, let me say, interesting statement. There were a few other things he mentioned that weren't shown in the video, but I've summarized them for you. First, it was about foreign policy. According to the Kremlin spokesperson, Donald Trump was not invited to the military parade in Moscow on May 9th. He was not invited. Of course, that's a clear sign of how cautious they are right now, even with symbolic gestures. At the same time, the Kremlin is of course dealing with expectations and also wants to see quick diplomatic breakthroughs. A single conversation between Putin and Trump, it is said, would hardly change the global situation. The conflicts are currently too numerous and far too complex. If we remember, the talks between Trump and the Kremlin hardly had any effect even before the other conflicts. That's a rather bleak outlook. Thanks for the next 20 euros in the chat. We're getting closer to our goal. Your support really helps keep the channel running. Economically, the picture is also mixed. While it is officially emphasized that the published figures are trusted, at the same time, a decline in the gross domestic product is admitted, because the Russian economy is doing poorly. In general, and I have to emphasize this again before I see the comment 1,000 times, the Russian economy, all in all, is stagnating, or sometimes it rises a little and sometimes it falls at the moment. Right now, it's pretty hard to say which direction it's going, but probably down a bit for now. Why has it continued to rise in recent years? Because the government has a lot of public funds at its disposal and can channel those funds into its own arms industry. The arms industry is being extremely promoted and supported, and as a result, you can also see that the economy in general is growing because the war economy is increasing significantly. On the other hand, since last year, we have seen a lot of companies going bankrupt. A lot of tax increases, a lot of proposals to make life in Russia a bit harder for ordinary citizens. So, as an unintended consequence of their decisions, that's how you have to put it, of course. For example, through high interest rates that you have to pay, or through simply high taxes. You know, the Russian pension is not high. It's about 240 euros. The average Russian salary is around 800 euros. It's pretty difficult, I have to say. Yes, you have to admit that, of course. On the Russian side, for ordinary citizens, especially if you earn, let's say, an average of 800 euros, there are some who only earn 600 euros and still have to pay rent. Or maybe they own property. Then it's not so bad. Maybe they pay rent. And a pack of butter costs 4 or 5 euros. That's a lot, of course. And all of this, of course, is because of a war. But Russia, or rather the Kremlin, doesn't really care much about ordinary citizens. They are more or less irrelevant. What's crucial is that they win the war, and the Kremlin believes that investing more money and resources in the military will advance them at the front. That's a bit difficult in a system like Russia's because of the high level of corruption. I'm not saying it's any different in Ukraine. Yes, of course, there's corruption in Ukraine too. There's no need to even discuss that. But especially in Russia, there have been a lot of corruption cases, and there are still a lot of corruption cases, and we can especially see it at the front. Even the soldiers are more or less being taken advantage of by their superiors in a lot of complaint videos. They have to pay protection money. Just imagine that. Just imagine you volunteer. Most Russians who are currently at the front are there voluntarily because they were promised a lot of money. They are promised that they will receive a large special payment. They are promised a good salary. They go to the front, and sometimes they do get paid. We have seen that some don't get paid at all, or better said, in this case. Then they are at the front and have to make sure they get cash, or that payments are made through their family members to their commanders. The commanders mostly spare them in the next assault. Instead of joining the first wave, you go in with the second or third, or stay off to the side and remain mostly passive. The first wave is usually made up of people who have acted unfairly toward the commander anyway. Well, unfair is of course unfair from the commander's point of view. Tester's first wave? You could more or less make that case even more strongly. People who, for example, don't pay protection money in units where things like that happen. Of course, it's not like that in every unit, but there have been reports about some units, and we've seen the complaint ourselves. And if they don't pay, they get used as cannon fodder. If they say something stupid, they get sent to the front lines. If they get drunk and get into fights, they get sent to the front lines. If they say something bad, they get sent to the front lines. If they mention the commander's actions, they're sent to the front lines, which in Russia means they're wiped out. You know this term. Feel free to use it yourself. I just noticed again, there's 20 euros. So thank you very much for that. We're already at 5 out of 10. That's really amazing. I think this is a good stream. I'm glad you have such an awesome community that helps me like this to get by. As I mentioned, a channel like this isn't free. There's ad revenue, and some people occasionally send me €1 or €2 on PayPal. But most of it, as I said, actually goes towards gathering information in the broadest sense, or for getting new patches for you. Or for projects. By the way, you can look forward to that. There are a few things in the pipeline that are going to be pretty interesting. At this point, I'd like to quickly show you something before we move on to the next topic. And as you can see for yourself, those who are taking part in this €20 challenge, the highest donation will get something. And another random donation from the over €20 pool. I'll show you what it is in a moment. And here, this is a Warntag medal. There are exactly 100 of them. 13 of them have already been given out. Who are they given to? They are given to people who, for example, have the rank of lieutenant colonel. They are given to people who have been very active in the channel. People who have also helped me gather information. For example, people I know who are at the front and always keep in touch with me, from whom I also get information, and simply a few honorable people as well, and of course also to viewers. I haven't gotten that far yet. I've already thought about it, that I will also give one to certain viewers for being especially active, but I haven't gotten to making the list yet. There are really a lot. Now I'll hold it up to the camera for a moment. This is what they look like when they're focused. You can see my dog who's already very interested in it. This is a small medal, and these are given to viewers like that. Exactly. And as I said, the highest donation today will definitely get one, and then another one will be given from the pool of donations over 20 euros. Thank you very much for that. And I just saw that we have another donation of 24 euros. Thank you very, very much for that. You are really helping a lot with this. And at least with me, you get something in return. I always think, I also do volunteer work, and I do a lot of it, not just in the fire department, but also in other areas. And I don't do all this to get something in return or anything like that, because otherwise it wouldn't be volunteer work. But I do feel a bit guilty myself when people help me. It's probably because of how I was raised. That's why, with me, there's always something, even a small thank you, because then it's just better. Yeah, I just think it's good that way. Here's another 20 euros Shiba Forever. Yeah, my dog has this one. If you're not familiar with the breed, that's a Shiba Inu. He refuses to sit in his spot, which is a bit difficult. But I'd say let's take a look further into the situation report. We still have 2 or 3 topics left. Then let's take a quick look at the map, and then we'll move on to the Q&A session. So stay tuned. Yes? While Russia, well, as I said, we've heard about this ceasefire. While Russia wants to decide on ceasefires itself to protect parades, Ukraine decides whether there will be parades at all. Because the parade on the 9th May doesn't just take place on Red Square in Moscow. It also takes place simultaneously in other major cities. For example, in the city of Samara. And we'll take a quick look at that as well. Yes, as you can see here, you could say they're first setting things up and then taking them down again. The stands and everything else are already in place, but they probably won't be used this year. Why won't they be used? Well, as I said, apparently Ukraine decides whether there will be parades because this parade was officially canceled due to a possible drone threat. Interesting. It looks similar in Moscow, only there it hasn't been canceled yet. I think that would be too big of a fiasco. Here we see anti-aircraft vehicles that were spotted in Moscow. Yes, they're moving toward Red Square. What did we learn before? Now think about it. What did we learn before? If you deploy air defense systems somewhere, they will be missing somewhere else. That means if there were to be a drone attack by Ukraine, Moscow is actually the best protected city in terms of air defense, but it's not the most well-protected place. Moscow is the second best protected place. The best protected place is Putin's villa. The second best protected place is the capital, Moscow. And if you bring anti-aircraft guns there again now, of course you only want to do that because you want to intercept drones. That means you assume the Ukrainians will attack, or you're doing it as a precaution. That's the right thing to do, nothing to criticize. It's good, at least for the Russians. If the Ukrainians attack now and there are people at this parade and you see nearby, oh, now the anti-aircraft fire is starting or a missile is being launched, it's still frightening, even if you manage to intercept a drone. Then you can say this drone has already gotten close to the parade, and that's already a big message, I would say. It has a lot of impact, even if it's intercepted. Who knows if they'll be stopped again in 6 months or at next year's parade, if it happens. Thanks so much for the 24 euros. You really support the channel. If you say now you intercept these things and people see that, then they get more or less scared, even if it's intercepted. And if the Ukrainians didn't attack, well, the Ukrainians have to attack. Even without attacking, you've caused the air defense systems to be moved closer to Moscow, leaving other areas less protected. That means here we have the opportunity, for example, to attack one refinery or another, one site or another. The Ukrainian intelligence service, they're not bad. We've seen this before, including in situation report complaints. I think it was Wednesday or Tuesday, so definitely from this week. Because what happened was that we saw Ukrainian drones flying around 1,500 kilometers inside Russia without being intercepted. That was for several hours, 8 to 10 hours, I think, according to the statement. It was actually a statement from the Russian type. They were actually upset about how it could be possible for Ukrainian drones to just fly across Russia. How is that possible? How is it possible that they can fly across Russia without being intercepted? and over such a distance. It's quite simple because Russia is trying to protect some high-value targets, and then there's just not enough left for the rest, and it's hard to protect such a large country across the board. Yes, and Russia always had the strength of being a large country, but this is exactly where it becomes its weakness. Let's watch the last video before the situation map. You can already see an attack on a ship by a Ukrainian sea drone. Another incident here demonstrates how attacks are now spreading to maritime targets. Near Novorossiysk port, which I showed you before, 2 tankers from the so-called Shadow Fleet were hit. The ships are suspected of being used for the export of raw materials in violation of sanctions. The attacks therefore took place right in the approaches to the port. So, in a place that should actually be considered especially secure. Just like before, you can see here, this is actually seconds before impact, that the ship was hit at the steering gear. The benefit is the ship isn't sunk and tanks aren't damaged, but its movement is greatly limited. There's no major oil spill since the tanks are farther forward in the ship. Still, costly repairs and ship salvage are needed, especially since the engine room is usually nearby. That means the ship most likely can't move on its own anymore, so you have to send other ships to tow it. That costs a lot of money. Of course, you also have to make sure that the ship gets repaired, and the insurance company will obviously be upset and raise the premiums, which makes things harder for all the freight forwarders and shipping companies, because they'll say, oh, now we have to pay extra to insure our ship if we call at this port. They'll have to stop at this port, so they'll earn less, and overall they'll make less because another ship is missing. And as a result, they have high follow-up costs. So pretty intense. Let's check the map. Novorossiysk is here, and the ship was attacked around here. That means we see a pretty good port here, a really good natural harbor which could be easily protected if you had the means at that location. Let's look at the front. Not much has changed. I recently said that I can summarize the entire front situation of the last week in maybe 5 minutes, 2103. I think I might be done even faster if I really tried. I'll quickly review the sections for anyone new to this map or who hasn't visited in a while. Nothing has changed here. This is the border with Belarus. Why would anything change? Ukraine secures this area with 4 brigades that rotate regularly with others. There's nothing to report from the Belarusian side. Here on this side, towards Sumy, you remember the Russians wanted to attack Sumy 2 years ago and establish another buffer zone here. The Ukrainians beat them to it and simply attacked Russia, marched into the Kursk region, and tried to destroy smaller ammunition depots and Russian outposts that they had prepared for the attack on Sumy. The FSB, Russia's domestic intelligence service, generally protects the border on the Russian side. They have border guards there who protect the border, and conscripts also protect the border. Of course, the FSB is not able to handle several brigades at one location. They are understaffed themselves when it comes to intercepting these large forces. So there were also conscripts involved. The conscripts surrendered. That was also shortly after the new conscripts had been drafted. That happens twice a year on the Russian side. Yes, most of them were then captured. I think 1,200 was the last number I had in mind. Back then, it was obviously good for the Ukrainians. They get units that have surrendered and can free units in return that are in Russian captivity. Yes, the Ukrainians captured a large area, about the size of Berlin. The Russians, with North Korean help, recaptured it and have since tried to create a buffer zone there. The area's size remains about the same as shown here. So in this area here, not much has changed. I see another membership was gifted. At least something has changed there. Thank you very much for that. I think there are some people who are grateful to you for that. Exactly. I'm rereading the chat. Someone mentioned ads. Yes, YouTube shows ads. I leave the video at the start and note that it should be monetized. But the algorithm needs a bit of time to see the content, and especially after the burning factories, it usually gets demonetized. He says they still see ads, but in the end, the money just stays with YouTube. It's a bit stupid, but oh well, what can you do with that system? Here, the next area, Umwurfchance. By the way, this here is red. This here is Russian occupied. I need to quickly redraw this. Don't think this was captured by Ukraine. No, it was captured by Russia. The Umwurfchance has more or less been completely captured by Russian forces. It only took 3 years. There were some attacks on villages here, but they were repelled. My last update is that Ukrainians fended them off. I haven't heard anything new. And that's probably how it stayed, since I haven't heard more about it. And that's on both sides, of course. You have to imagine I checked the information from both sides as well. Kupiansk. Yes, they wanted to capture it. They got pretty far in. Everything that's marked light blue here used to be under Russian control. The Ukrainians pushed them back. Zelensky once sent a video from the blue area saying they had managed to push the Russians back. Since then, little has changed. Near Pishchany, Russians' attack and skirmishes are constant. So actually, this is still a gray zone. There have always been some skirmishes here. The Russians were pushed back here the last time. But as you can see, this situation is 4 months old. Since then, not much has happened here. I check this section of the image nearly every day. But basically, it can be said that the Russians are still trying to advance further here in Pishchane. On the one hand, via the P07 road. On the other hand, they are trying to advance through this village, setting up forward outposts here to establish and then attack via Kupiansk. I'm not sure they can still achieve that this year, but I doubt it. Nothing has happened here at this spot. That's still an old marking. Don't let that fool you. I've now heard that the Ukrainians have launched counterattacks again, especially here in this area, towards the city center. But there's not much new there either. There are hardly any geolocations. The Ukrainians hardly post anything anymore on their side. That's pretty difficult because of OPSEC. It's the same on the Russian side. That means when it comes to information, on the one hand, you have to say they're trying to conceal as much as they possibly can. On the other hand, very little is actually happening at the front right now. It's not for nothing that you've been seeing drone reports from the front in recent days. Similar things in Konstantinivka. They're still trying to take the greenhouse and also the methane fueling station at the same time. The fighting may have shifted a bit further north by now, about here, at the level of this road. But not much more is known either. This area here, and I see here, there's someone again, thank you very much for that. Welcome to the Allgäu crew. Not much has changed towards the vocational school either. That's also an old geolocation from one of the older situation reports. As I mentioned, I used to draw the front sections. I admit, I was quite overambitious then. Back then, I did it every day. And now just look at this. Every day, everything on this map, which now takes forever to load because of all my entries. That's my fault, not the providers. But I updated everything every day, every front section, everything. And if I saw a video, for example, from the 155th Marine Infantry, I even know roughly where they are, then I immediately redrew the 155th as well. It's right here at this spot. That's not the Marine Infantry. It's the 155th Mechanized Brigade. If I saw a video of them, I marked them at the new front section. But I really can't keep doing that for every section every day. Back then, though, the reports only took a few minutes. Today, we're doing a stream. Yeah. This front section is interesting. Let's stay here for now. It's about Pokrovsk. This was most recently captured by the Russians. That's Rizhne. And, I would say it's 100% captured by the Russians. This spot up here is supposed to be captured by the Ukrainians. But I haven't seen anything about that for a long time. I assume it's already been captured by the Russians. Rudinsky. New fighting here at Rudinsky. The Russians are attacking from the north, mainly with the 5th Motorized Brigade and also from the east. The pressure here is extremely high. I think the Ukrainians can hold out for a few more weeks, but if they don't get any support here, it's going to be tough. There are still Ukrainian fortifications here. This is all still before the Dnipro line, or before a part of the Dnipro line. And, what can I say? Say, a little. Difficult for both sides. There aren't that many attacks, but the pressure is still high. If the Ukrainians make a mistake here, then I would say the momentum shifts back to the Russian side. Then they could recapture this area if the Ukrainians can continue to hold and supply it. For now, it's working. Then it will remain Ukrainian for a while, but I think sooner or later, if things continue at this pace, it will eventually fall to the Russians. And now, 9 out of 10 people who signed up for the race for the medal are already standing here. What a turnout. Thank you very much for that. He is a great supporter of the channel.
Und
Yes, a big shout out to all of them, actually. So, this is part of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Since then, little has changed. Ukrainians claim to have liberated many villages, but these villages here were also included, which, to my knowledge, were not actually under Russian control, but maybe a Russian soldier just briefly entered them. On the Russian side, the number of liberated villages is reported as lower. Of course, that's a hostile statement. It's the statement of the opposing side. Well, what can you say about that? There's no more progress. There are 3 important positions: Hill 161, 167, and 134. They definitely have to capture and hold one of these 3, in this case 134. Then they can continue attacking here via Wozbanivka and recapture this old line that they lost in September last year. On the other hand, they could also capture these 2 hills here at the same time, and would then have the opportunity to reach this line here as well. But the momentum has decreased. We hardly see anything happening here lately. So it's pretty difficult. I would say the offensive it hasn't failed. After all, they were able to liberate villages. But it definitely hasn't brought the success that was actually expected here so far. All right. At this point, as I said, not much has happened at the front. I was able to get through the whole thing quickly. There was pretty much nothing. Most of what we see is actually based on attacks either in Crimea, where air defense systems are being destroyed again, or radar systems, like we've seen the last few times. Or we see attacks here on the Black Sea near Novorossiysk and Sochi. That was more or less the situation in terms of information. Not much has really happened at the front. And that's been the case for a while now. By the way, we have 1,289 viewers watching at the same time. That's pretty crazy. We've always been around the 1,000 mark. It's not the record yet. I think the record was once at 1,400, but not bad, I have to say, considering we're streaming again. I'd say let's take a look at the Q&A session, shall we? I'd say I'll answer some questions now. Let's see how quickly we get through them. How do you do that? I mentioned it earlier. Just write Jerker Frage and then your question. But you can't write anything before Jerker Frage. You can't use a smiley or anything else. Otherwise, the bot won't recognize it. Then a space, then your question, and then it will appear for me, and then we can answer it. And I can see here right now the goal has been reached. The goal has been reached. Another 20 euros just came in. That's the 10th donation. Thank you very much for that. You helped finance this stream. You kept this channel running for today and made sure that I was able to cover at least part of the expenses here through the stream. Thank you very much for that. Of course, it has to be said that YouTube gets a small percentage of that as well. And of course, I also have to pay taxes. But what remains definitely covers part of the expenses for the channel. At this point, thank you very much. And as I said personally, I don't have to benefit financially from it. I'm very involved in volunteer work, including with the channel. Even though it would benefit me, I wouldn't insist on it. Other channels, not just in German-speaking areas, have done this and have their own situation map. They've locked the situation map and said only people who pay can access it, and so on and so forth. But I don't even want to start with that here. As I said, goal achieved. I'm very proud of this community. Thank you. 1,300 viewers at once. Great. Let's review the questions. As a viewer, you can also see this page here. The link is sometimes shown by the moderators. You can click on it here, and then a question that you find very, very important will be upvoted and shown to me at the very top. A question that doesn't seem that important, You can downvote it, and then it will be shown at the bottom. What's the advantage of this? Of course, a Q&A session like this can't go on forever. It's time limited after all. And this way, the most important or interesting questions are very likely to be answered for sure, and others just get left out. But those can be asked next time. I scheduled it for 9:30 p.m., but I see there are 24 questions. I'll see how far we get. Then I'll let you know when I'll answer the last question. Then you can all write in again, and at some point we'll cut it off. Since today is Sunday, I know you want a good start tomorrow. Hokan Wide, member question. What's the current status of defenses against fiber optic FPV drones? Israel is basically walking right into the trap at the moment. Well, the current status is this. Fiber optic drones can more or less only be countered by shooting them down, ramming them with other drones, or using a very, very strong light signal. We've also seen that in a video before. A drone flew there and then directed a very, very strong concentrated light signal at the fiber optic cable of a lurking fiber optic drone. And as a result, the communication was blocked and the drone was immobilized. As far as I could tell, I asked a few friends from hardware engineering, and they said that it only works to a limited extent. So as long as this light beam is on it, the drone can't move. If the drone flies away, it can eventually recover. That means the most effective way is still to shoot down the drone, because drones guided by fiber optic cables can't be electronically jammed. Alternatively, of course, if you ever get hold of this cable, this thin cable, you can simply cut it. Then the connection is also interrupted. We've seen 23 videos proving it works. But the most effective way here is really just to shoot it down. I just noticed another 10 euros in the chat with a message. Thanks so much for dedicating your time to this channel during your training. Greetings from Austria. Thank you. I'm happy to keep going. Yes, there's a lot to do, studies, work, the channel on the side, volunteering, and all sorts of things. But I enjoy doing it, as I said. I did all this better because I saw a lot of German reporters who are very long-winded. I always wanted to get everything across as briefly and concisely as possible. And that's what I do with daily reports. Which German weapons are still used in Ukraine? Quite a few. For example, the Panzerhaubitze 2000 is in use, though I haven't seen it recently. We saw it used extensively during the Battle of Bakhmut 2 years ago. But at the moment, there aren't big battles like before. It was also used at Avdiivka. Big thanks in the chat. Just received 50 euros. Thank you so much. Your support really helps the channel. As I said, I just mentioned all the bets. Oh my God, I'm already saying all the bets. Amounts over 20 euros go into this pot, including yours. Thank you very much. Really great. Although you've now made the biggest donation, so actually you've already secured something for yourself. As I said, there are a lot of German weapons that are in Ukraine. Listing them all now would take too much time, but you can check on the federal government's website. There's a page where it shows which weapons are already in Ukraine, up to a certain point. Since March, it hasn't been updated anymore, but at least until then, you know what has been delivered. It's about deployment. It also involves ground vehicles and various equipment. All of that is viewable up to a certain point about a year ago. Just take a look in there. Next, what about the export of Ukrainian weapons technology? You keep hearing that the Ukrainians are starting to become an exporting country and are supporting others in exchange for demands. Yes, very well observed. Numerous 10-year contracts have been signed in the Middle East. Currently, according to their own statements, Ukrainians are producing more drones in some areas than they use. It's not just about FPV drones or long-range drones, especially not about long-range drones, but there are many drones, especially in drone defense, that are on the Ukrainian side. Are now being exported, and especially drones for the defense against Shahed drones, and it's exactly the type of drone that is also used in Iran. Is also being used. Just imagine during hours of war in Iran, The U.S. has fired off $4 billion worth of air defense resources for cheap Shahed drones. One of these Shahed drones costs $130,000. So, firing off a $3.5 million Patriot missile for that is, of course, pretty dumb. The Ukrainians have come up with good alternatives. A Sting drone is the interceptor drone, an interceptor drone from the company Wild Hornets, and it costs about 3,500. 3,500 euros isn't expensive for an interceptor drone. You could launch 5 or 6 and still spend less than on Shahed drones. And drones like the Sting drones are now being exported abroad, including drone teams that provide training, including courses, but also including reconnaissance devices, especially acoustic sensors that are meant to detect Shahed drones or other aerial threats in advance. That's one thing. On the other hand, there are partnerships, for example with Germany, that want to expand and adopt the Ukrainians' drone technology. And that would be a big advantage for us because we have a country here that is a leader in drone technology and also shows that it works relatively simply and you don't always need high-end solutions, as people in Germany usually tend to think, I guess. And we cooperate with them and we also draw our own conclusions from that. Maybe there will also be weapons that we will produce together in the future, which of course is especially good for the Bundeswehr, to prepare ourselves against the drone threat. Because I keep seeing us, or us in the sense of the West, always lagging a bit behind. Was there an official confirmation about the shot at 5,500 meters from the Leopard 2? This refers to a record shot that is said to have been carried out by the Ukrainian side. This is about the destruction of a Russian tank from about 500 meters. I spent quite a bit of time looking into this topic in the days that followed. I haven't learned anything new about it yet. Things like this need to be verified. That usually takes, I would say, about half a year, but I'll try to remember the question. As I said, I'm still researching the topic. If I discover anything new, I'll share it in the situation report or possibly upload a separate video. What about exporting Ukrainian weapons technology? That was the earlier question. Why is there so little coverage of Ukrainian attacks on Russian railways, given Russia's heavy reliance on them? Bombing signal boxes, bridges, and so on? Yes, that's a good question. Let's take a look at the map. We saw a lot of attacks last year. Here in this area, we've seen attacks. We've also seen attacks that reached as far as Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad, so here, and in this square, basically from Stalingrad or Volgograd today, up to this blue pin, from the blue pin to Rostov, a very important logistics hub. 70% of the goods to the Ukrainian front go through Rostov. Down to here, over there, and then back up here to Volgograd. There have been a lot of attacks recently on the Russian rail network, especially in 2025. Last year. Since then, we haven't heard as much. I can imagine. Of course, I can't speak for the Ukrainians because only they know why they're doing it. And if they don't make it public, then we can only guess. In my opinion, though, that's the case because, because the U.S. and Israel have started a war in Iran. This war has driven up oil prices. This war is causing oil and gasoline prices to rise not only here in the West. It also means that Russia can benefit again. Remember, a barrel of oil cost $50 to $60 just before the war in Iran. Or during bad times, yes, and in this case, bad times are actually good times for Ukraine because they can buy cheaply and Russia doesn't earn as much from it. Russia, or the State Duma, calculated the budget expecting an oil price of $80 to $90 per barrel. That's what they calculated for the war, too. Then the oil price dropped, which was obviously bad, and now that it has gone up again, it's good for Russia again. They're making more money again, and also, I would say because the Strait of Hormuz was closed for a while, even the, let's say, less attractive Russian oil was still being bought. It's not just unattractive from the European perspective, it's also unattractive from the Asian region's perspective, because there is better oil, especially the oil from the Arab countries. And that's what's primarily being bought. And now I can imagine that oil prices are going to rise. That Ukraine says now they're primarily attacking energy facilities again? Yes, especially those that cause extreme financial damage to Russia, since they make less profit as a result. Now they're using these drones for that instead of, say, attacking train stations in the hinterland again. That's what I could imagine, yes. Because after the attacks on the railways, we hardly had any
Zu
coherent response from the Ukrainian side. No attack or anything or nothing that would build on that, let's say. The next question, what do you do if you're suddenly alerted? Feuerwehr Auto. Good question. Yes, I'm still with the volunteer fire department. If called, I'll get up and go. A lot of alarms are about saving lives. Saving lives is one of the things I really like to do. And no matter if it's directly during an operation or passively, as we know, we've donated a lot to Ukraine, including vehicles, to help save people. We've donated sniffer and search dogs. Saving people is something you can actively pursue, and that's what this community has done most of all. I'm especially proud of them for that. And like I said, when I get alerted, that's when it starts. Then I get up and go. It's the same in my personal life. Alarms like that aren't always predictable, so you have to make some sacrifices in your personal life. Some people just sacrifice more than others. Is there current data on what percentage of Russian oil exports is being lost to airstrikes? Yes, there is. The problem with this data is just that it is no longer being updated upwards. Yes, there is such a table. I can't remember right now what the name of the person who posted it was. I've shown it a few times in Lagerverde and a few more times on Telegram. It shows the largest oil refineries on the Russian side. It says underneath how often they've been attacked and so on. And it also lists their production capacity. But the thing is, when a refinery is hit and it is said
ja,
it can now only produce 85% of its total capacity, then it stays on this list at 85%. That means if the Russians, for example, can repair the component or increase operations again, then this is no longer updated in the table. That means it only goes further down, but not back up. That's why, yes, there is data on what percentage of Russian oil exports are lost due to airstrikes, but there isn't really any current data, at least none that are accessible to us. I'm an OSINT reporter, not an intelligence agency. There is speculation about whether Russia's next move will be to target and destroy Ukraine's water supply. In any case, there are fears for Ukraine, but on the other hand, Russia's water supply would also be at risk. Yes, well, you have to look at it this way. Water supply. Most of the Russian attacks we see when it comes to water are targeting dams on the Ukrainian side. We also saw an attack like that 2 weeks ago. It's mostly about flooding areas to make it difficult for people there, yes, but also to prevent troop concentrations or troop movements, yes. Moving troops over fully flooded roads is obviously difficult, and that's why, as I said, most attacks from what I've seen in the past on the Russian side, when it comes to water facilities, they usually target dams or reservoirs. On the Ukrainian side, you very, very rarely see something like that. And I also wouldn't know what great benefit there would be for the Ukrainian side. I think if they use their resources to blow up the next refinery or something like that, they would gain more from that than by flooding an area. The Russians probably don't care anyway. We saw the flood 2 years ago or a year ago. Many areas around Rostov were flooded. The drinking water was completely contaminated. I shared many complaint videos and situation reports from residents saying they only get 1 bottle a week from the government, can't shop anymore due to flooding, and have only dirty water to drink, even resorting to puddles. As I said, the government more or less doesn't care what happens to the Russians there, which is of course very unfortunate. But I don't think the Ukrainians would have benefited from that either, because they always say in those complaint videos, "Hello, Putin, everything is cool, and thank you for being there for us, and Russia should win this war. Oh, by the way, we don't have anything left to drink. But that's not your fault. That's basically, in an exaggerated way, the message in all these complaint videos.
Uh,
How do you think the situation for Ukraine will develop this year? That could get very interesting. So, at this point here it says Oslavokrin. At this point, the Ukrainians have announced that they will launch offensives this year. I'm sure that the small offensive we saw earlier was not the main thing the Ukrainians have been working towards. I think as we move a bit closer to summer, we could see offensive movements from the Ukrainian side. I'm pretty sure they will try to launch attacks as well. They've concluded they can't win a war by staying on the defensive. In 2024, they already said this would be the year of defense. Yeah, and then in 2025, there was Kursk. You could count that as an attack, but it was more or less spontaneous. In 2016, they said they needed to go on the offensive again, and I think they will attack. The question is how this will develop. Ideally for Ukraine, it would be positive. In the best case, it reaches a position that the Russians won't be able to recapture in the near future. But of course, the whole thing is just an estimate, yeah. I also don't think that if they approach it like they did the last times, I don't think it will lead to a big success. The Ukrainians attack very, very often with very small groups. Most of the time, it's only light to medium vehicles. We rarely see tanks, which is understandable. Of course, you have to say the Russians also use drones, yeah. And the Russians use drones just as often as the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians were to launch such a large attack over a wide area with many vehicles and many units, it would probably end up like many Russian attacks, yeah. That means you have to find exactly the right level between staying inconspicuous and not being too large, but at the same time being effective. And I think if we look at the recent attacks, the Ukrainians aren't quite there yet. There were also attacks where I myself wondered why they were carrying them out at that particular spot. In my opinion, other locations would have been better. Easier. Yes. And I see it in the comments because it said Slava Ukraini right here at this point. By the way, I can't read Cyrillic script. That's often claimed. I can't do it. I know it because behind me there are, if I count them now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 flags that I got from Ukrainian soldiers. Pretty much every one of them says Slava Ukraini on it. So you can recognize some things. In the back, I think there are also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 certificates. And I'm sure every one of them says that on it. And on the certificate I got from Klitschko, it says that too. By the way, I got a certificate from Klitschko, which I already posted once. That one, it says it on there too. So there are some things you just recognize. You know what it says even if you can't read it. Exactly. Let's move on to the next question. Is it just me or does it look... Yes. Is it just me or is the front completely frozen right now? Yes, it's completely frozen. It's not just your imagination. Strikes on soft targets in the rear are pretty much all we can see. There's not much else we can report. It's especially clear in the past few days. So what are you supposed to do? The front is at a standstill. Neither Russia nor Ukraine is making progress. We've seen the whole front stay almost unchanged. In the situation report from, I think it was Thursday, I also showed the front line from exactly 1 year ago and then the current front line. Not much has changed. In 2024, the Russians managed to capture about 0.9% of Ukraine. Well, actually, that's not correct. That's not accurate anymore. It's been going on for over 1,000 days. I think over 1,010 days. Yes, exactly. From 2024 onwards, in any case, there was a report that I showed last year. It said that over the last, I think, 1,010 days, about 0.94% of Ukraine has been conquered. That was with extremely heavy losses on the Russian side. Nothing is moving forward. A snail that had started here in the far east of Ukraine on the day of the special operation would have already reached somewhere in Poland 2 years ago if it had just crawled straight forward. That's why it's going to take a long time. If the Russians has continued like this in the Donbass, or even if they change tactics or make a breakthrough It could still take them 5 to 10 years, not even considering their own country's situation. It's really going to take a long time. For the whole of Ukraine, I think 256 years is a very good estimate if they keep going at this pace or even intensify their efforts a bit. We already have that. How much will sales of Russian arms change after the war? Western systems are more expensive in every respect, but much better. Yes, of course, it all depends on how the war will end. If Russia loses the war badly, then I think that won't be good for arms exports. I think they'll try to figure something out. They might buy other things, and Russia could join another alliance. Wants to establish itself before collaborating with them. That's unlikely, since Russians are proud of their technology. Still, I believe Russian arms exports will change. We can see it ourselves here, for example, in Syria. We can also see that Iran, in particular, has a lot of Russian military equipment, especially air defense systems, and they hardly did anything during the last attacks. We also saw that back then during Colombia. We also saw it in Venezuela. Many Russian systems were simply destroyed. The Americans flew in and out without any real losses. Of course, that says a lot about Russian systems and not necessarily anything good. I'll take a quick sip, then answer the next questions. All right, I'm back. By the way, I'd say I'll answer the last question around 9:45 p.m. You can upvote the interesting questions yourself, and those will definitely be answered. I see that we still have 35 questions in the pipeline. You can just pick out the most important or the most interesting questions. Let's continue. Is it possible to attack all border signal boxes with drones? Anything is possible, of course. It would also be possible, in theory, to attack all the signal boxes in Russia, especially those in Western Russia. But I don't think that will really happen so quickly. I'm not a railway worker, but regarding all the derailments on the Russian side that we've seen, and all the times railway lines were blown up, I've been told that such things are actually fixed pretty quickly. So at most within a few days. Deutsche Bahn, of course, sets a negative example, but normally it's fixed again within a few days. A signal box is, of course, a bit more complex. I don't know how long it takes to get something like that back up and running. I'm not a railway worker and lack the expertise, though. I'm quite interested in the field. But as I said, a lot of things are possible. Whether it makes sense is another question. Wouldn't it make sense for the West to have Ukrainian drone instructors teach their tactics?
What's up?
To teach the tactics? I have the feeling that the West is way behind when it comes to military developments. The West is always lagging behind, but that's simply the nature of the West. That's partly naivety, but it's also partly, I don't know, I'll just say. In Germany, I often notice the belief that we must always create top-tier high-tech products, which ends up being extremely expensive and extremely stupid. And then you think to yourself, well, for example, we've never actually been involved in a drone war, not once. At the same time, we're trying to develop our own strategies, or NATO is trying to develop its own strategies, and developing strategies is totally fine. But the problem is we have a country that has actually developed its own strategies, and did so actively during a war. And yet we still think we know better. And I think that's a real shame because that's exactly how we end up with the wrong mindset. Part of our defense industry says, hey, we just have to do things this way because it's tried and true. But maybe a different approach would actually be much better. So yeah, and right now it's like this. Drone pilots are being...
Piloten...
especially after the last NATO failure, they're being invited, especially in Germany too. We have that here. So it's not like nobody is doing it. Other countries are doing the same. But I think it's way too late. It's 2026 now. We could have actually started in 2023 or at the latest in 2024. Yeah. And yeah, it's difficult. Like I said, they should have done it earlier. Now it's being done, which is good. And it's absolutely the right thing to do.
Um,
But when it comes to drone construction, I still see us lagging behind a bit. We also saw it in the statement from the head of Rheinmetall that drones are being built by housewives and people like that. That's partly true, but he meant it as an insult, since they're made with 3D printers in basements. We're still Ukrainian drone pilots, and they've performed absolutely amazingly twice during a NATO exercise, managing to destroy the entire opposing side, meaning the NATO side. And that was with only a few drone pilots. And there was no AI involved. There was no system that cost millions. Those were cheap drones. And with them, they were able to destroy extremely expensive systems. Yes. And then to have this arrogance and think, oh, if we build drones in Germany, then they have to be AI supported, and preferably as expensive as possible. Well, they're usually extremely expensive anyway when they're made here, but AI supported. And this and that and this gimmick, and you need that too. Maybe they should be launched from a launch pad instead of us doing it from the ground. The Ukrainians have to do that. Yeah, that's just the German way of thinking, and I think it'll take a bit longer to get rid of that. But like I said, trainers are there now. Recently, 2 Su-57S were actually damaged. This is about an attack that I had included in the situation report. I did write it in earlier, but I didn't mention it due to a lack of information. There was an attack on a Russian airfield where Su-34s and Su-57s were present. Su-57, you have to imagine, that's one of the next generation fighters on the Russian side. Supposedly has stealth capability. It's considered a very good aircraft. We've checked it out several times. I even made a video about it, my 4th or 5th one, that focused on the aircraft. You can think what you want about it, but in any case, it's a prestige asset for Russia. Yes, that's an aircraft they don't want to lose, which is also extremely expensive, and which they are not actively using in the war in Ukraine. They fly with other aircraft near the front, but not that one, fearing Ukrainians could shoot it down. That's why they moved it far away. And when Ukrainians got ATAC EMS and Storm Shadow missiles, they moved it even further. But now there was an attack on an airfield, or rather an airbase since we're talking military terms, where Su-57S were located. There's a before and after picture that I don't have now, but I'll describe it. In the before picture, the planes are parked in their positions. In the after picture, you can see some debris, but nothing that you could clearly say was the plane.
Also,
It could have been anything. It could have been this or that, yes. It might have been a ground vehicle or a parked Su-34 that was hit, or something else entirely. Since some evidence is still missing, I'd wait. By tomorrow or the next day, it'll be in the situation report anyway. Wouldn't it make sense if I already have? Will Russia go all in if they are not going to lose? Let's say it's 2032, the war is still going on, and by all in, I mean full mobilization. How would NATO react? I think NATO wouldn't really react except with outrage. But a mobilization on the Russian side is extremely unpopular. And we recently heard Igor Girkin as well, who said that it wouldn't make any sense anymore. If they had done it a few years ago, maybe it would have made a difference at the front. But if they mobilize now, I mean, just imagine if Russia were to suddenly mobilize 500,000 men right now. Where or with what would they equip them? First problem, who pays all these people? Second problem. Third problem, how do you supply all these people? Even now, there are many front areas where they don't even have water anymore. How do you plan to supply 500,000 more men? And even if none of that mattered, you would be creating a group of people who were forced, who are not there voluntarily. They were forced into a war of aggression, not even to defend their homeland, but to go into a war of aggression. That means they're already demotivated, because if they won't go for all the money they're getting now, they won't go for more money either, and certainly not for less money. And in this case, they would get even less money. That means they go into this war of aggression, they're not really motivated anyway, And they don't feel the same way. I mean, a lot of people at the front really think they're protecting Russia. But they won't think that because they were mobilized. They just want to survive. You can easily imagine that. And then you just have a large number of people you somehow have to take care of, which you probably won't manage. And of course, that will hurt their morale even more. Then they are around. It's full. Then they are unmotivated. And of course, that has many negative consequences. First, mobilization is very unpopular in Russia. They are then unmotivated. Naturally, they won't perform at the front either. And in the end, you see a bunch of people that you just have there that you can't take care of and who are simply angry. And that's obviously difficult for the Russian side. So, as I said, I'll answer questions until 45. Those will be the last questions I answer. As I said, I think regarding Alan,
Im
maybe they'll do it, but it won't make sense. I think they know that. I can much more easily imagine that they'll throw around some threats or try to somehow get out of this war. But I also don't think it will last until 2032, to be honest. Speaking of the Black Sea Fleet, what's actually left of it? There's also a list, and if I manage, I'll link it on Telegram. There you can see the current status of the Black Sea Fleet. It's actually kept pretty up to date. With the Black Sea Fleet, you can see how it's currently structured, which ships are in operation, which have been sunk or which have been heavily damaged. Is it even possible to extinguish a large fire, like an oil depot? Yes, it is. If you have the resources nearby, you have to inform the site, of course. Can you pump out remaining oil? I've heard that's not possible. I've heard it's possible with facilities that aren't affected by the fire, but pumping oil out of a burning facility is obviously a bad idea. I can imagine that. I would think it's a stupid idea. But as I said, in areas that aren't affected theoretically, as far as I could tell, yes. Could drones be used to attack signal boxes at borders? Yes, that's possible. How long do you think this war will last? Or rather, how long will Russia or Ukraine or the EU be able to afford it? I think, of course, you have to say the EU can definitely afford it. The EU could have afforded much more and would have saved money by strongly supporting Ukraine from the start. Then maybe the war would have gone differently. Russia. The question is, how long can Russia afford this? Russia can afford it as long as the people eventually get tired of it. Of course, the question is how long that will take. Russia's biggest enemy is not going bankrupt or losing the war at the front. Russia's biggest enemy is its own people who will eventually have had enough. As I said, an average salary of 800 euros, and if butter costs 67 euros, that's obviously difficult. And they put up with a lot, you have to admit that. The Russian people endure a lot. And a large part of them still support the war and approve of it. The only question is how much more they can endure. Because we can see it with Tuapse as well. The war is fine as long as you can still go swimming at the harbor and your summer vacation isn't ruined. Oh no. Over 1 million Russians have fallen in Ukraine. They don't care about that. The oil port is polluted. It's a problem because you can't swim with your child now. Yes, that's roughly how you should imagine it. So I think afford. Russia will keep funding the war as long as it chooses. The Kremlin will continue it. And see it through to the end no matter what. In your opinion, how will the special operation end? Hard to say, you know. The viewers who have been with us for a long time, they know the following. When I make a statement, then it turns out to be true 99% of the time. But the statements I make, I usually only make them for 1 or 2 weeks in advance. We saw this in the battle for Bakhmut. I announced the Wagner Group's attack a day early, and the March of Justice followed the next day. Things like that work very well. I have an IQ of 136 in all sorts of things. I have, how should I put it, more or less, I wouldn't call it a talent, but I have the innate ability to recognize the connection between action and reaction relatively quickly, and to quickly consider different scenarios to weigh them. For example, over 2 weeks. But I don't know when the war in Ukraine, or rather when it will end. I can't really estimate that because there are so many factors that we don't know, and they can appear more or less out of nowhere. And of course, I would say they would make the whole calculation a bit more difficult. It's a bit hard. Still, 35 questions left. What do you think? Write it in the comments. Should I answer a few more questions? Let's see. Should I answer 10 more questions? We have a question limit now and no time limit anymore. If I should answer 10 more questions, let me know in the comments. I'll take a quick sip while I wait. By the way, since I'm just reading it in the comments, the live stream won't be every day. It says here that a viewer prefers the daily shorts. I can understand that too. That's kind of what this channel does. I'll stick with the shorts too. The regular situation reports aren't gone. A stream like this will happen once a week. I see a lot of yeses, so we'll do 10 more questions. If the community wants it, I'll do anything for the community. You know that. You're just as important to me, even if we're here every day. It's great here, Albuku. The best crew ever. We can even see that through the YouTube algorithm. Exactly, I already have that one. That doesn't count. Let's do the next 10. How successful are great powers in the 21st century in times of AI and drones? Both Russia and the USA seem to be missing their goals and lowering their expectations. It's not really due to great powers themselves, it's more about these countries' attitudes. The Kremlin, not Russia. The Kremlin is a construct that has a lot of arrogance. They are the greatest, they are the best, they have the best, and so on and so forth. We see the same thing on the US side, especially under the MAGA administration. And I would say there is a kind of great naivety.
Oh.
And they don't really get over that. And that's why they cling to old goals, to old doctrines, to old plans. And of course, you also have to say that in one or another leadership or advisory staff, there are people who just have no idea. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. For example, in Germany, if I say I'm a military expert, I can just claim that. There's no expert certificate. There's nothing that says this man is really a military expert. I can just claim it. I could work as a military expert. Just imagine, just to give you an example, I become self-employed and say I'm a military expert and start a consulting company. And for that consulting company, of course, there are 1 or 2 consulting certifications. There are already some preliminary exams for consulting, and yes, simply requirements that you have to meet in order to practice it, especially when you're self-employed. But theoretically, anyone can still do it. And even if I have no idea about the military, and now I go there, and the federal government hires me and asks me, now what? For example, as, I don't know, a 60-year-old man who had an extremely good career in the Bundeswehr, highly promoted or something, and then you ask me for my opinion on drone technology. And I have no idea about drone technology because it didn't exist in recent years. The drones, I know, are still really big and carry 2 or 3 missiles and used to fly around in Afghanistan, something like that. And then he says, AI is just some weird stuff that nobody knows about and probably won't catch on anyway. And drones, they have to be big and, I don't know, controlled from Ramstein and all sorts of things. Small drones are just a phenomenon. We heard that from the start. Many former Bundeswehr generals have called it just a phenomenon. People said we'd see drones and that kind of thing for the next few months and then not anymore. Widest spread ever, yeah. And I think we have a lot of these people in the West, especially in advisory positions, which in my opinion, they simply shouldn't hold. Yes, and the problem is, especially in the West, and there's a lack of trust, I would say, in younger people, in my opinion. There's a lot of reliance on tried and true methods, and that's a very, very big problem when it comes to innovation in war, because that's such a simple principle. If I want to be progressive, then I can't hold on to old things, right? If I always want to be at the forefront, then I have to make sure that I am at the forefront and not say, 20 years ago we did it this way and that way. Then it will probably still work well. We saw that in the skirmishes between NATO and Ukrainian drone pilots. NATO lost twice. Coincidence? I don't think so. What is the current desertion rate on both sides? It's hard to say. I don't have exact numbers, but soldiers on both sides are deserting. I have the feeling it's become a bit less than in recent years, to be honest. But especially on the Ukrainian side, it has mostly referred to certain units. You could say that. And on the Russian side, I would say that's the case along the entire front, except for Kherson. Pretty much the same. I would say the proportion of soldiers deserting is about the same. With the Ukrainians, it's usually about a specific unit. For example, back then it was about the 155th Mechanized Infantry Brigade, which had a very, very high desertion rate because they were formed, sent directly to the front with insufficient training, insufficient equipment, and all sorts of other issues. And they thought they would be sent to their deaths right away, and they also didn't get any drone support, which is crucial in this war. There are many deserters. Of course, you have to say that it's more about units. Once the unit is formed, with the Russians, I would say it's more like that along the entire front, except for Kherson. And that's currently hard to answer. Both sides, of course, are keeping quiet about it as much as possible. Do you have any information about the risk that the pipelines for extraction could run dry if there is no storage capacity? Could that happen? I don't have any information about that. Does that mean the extraction towards Europe or the extraction within Russia? Because within Russia, there is a pipeline network, which is also built like a ring system near Moscow. Sources that supply this pipeline, and it won't dry up there. But it's different with other pipelines. It's a bit harder there.
Aber
But as far as I know, that's something we won't see anytime soon. A lot more needs to happen for that. How many self-propelled mortars does the Bundeswehr have, and how many could be given to Ukraine for support? I don't know the exact number. Just check the Bundeswehr's website. The Bundeswehr has very, very good articles about every weapon system on its info page, including the number of units and all sorts of things. So all the relevant information. How many could be given for support is, of course, a good question. As I said, I don't know the current contingent. The question is, of course, how much would make sense to give to Ukraine and whether they actually need it. But I think in every respect, they need almost everything. Do you think the Kerch Bridge will fall anytime soon? Are you referring to this bridge here? I don't think so anymore. The Kerch Bridge could have been blown up 2 years ago. That would have made sense back then. What are the Russians doing here? So they have a bridge here, and for example, a train goes over it, and diesel or oil is shipped across. And at the same time, there are ferries going back and forth here, and the train also stops there. Then it drops off the oil wagons, the tank wagons, and they are taken across by ferry and then picked up by another train. Those ferries are nearly all gone. They were all attacked. The last one was also attacked, as I noted in the situation report about a week and a half ago. That means the train is the last thing that can cross over here and supply the rest here. The problem for the Russians earlier was that they supplied the entire southern front via this railway line. Trucks, including tankers, drove here as if it were a road, which was very laborious. It required many people, tankers, and lots of capacity. There was no railway here. A few years ago, the Russians finished their railway from Rostov through Taganrog and Mariupol, continuing onward, and they supply through this route. That means if the Ukrainians were to blow up this bridge, the Russians will simply supply overland here, So this strategic advantage of blowing it up doesn't really exist anymore. That means it's difficult. The only other reason why it would be worthwhile is if the Ukrainians, like they did in 2023 during their summer offensive, tried to split the front here with a land offensive. And with that, also the land supply, then you could attack the bridge and destroy their supply there. But that won't happen here. The area along the Soviet line is pretty much the most fortified or protected area in terms of strongholds on the Russian side in occupied Ukraine. So I don't think anything will happen there. Is it foreseeable when the oil supply in Russia will finally collapse, since the refinery now has to be hit almost daily? Will there be significant effects in the future? Yes. Here's why. Not necessarily foreseeable. What happens if they don't get as much oil anymore? Then we'll see long lines at gas stations again, just like last time. And it goes on like that for several weeks. And then hardly anything changes. Russia can also import oil, and Russia will. And you'll see that. If things get really bad at some point, they'll also import oil. And the oil they import, they will refine again. And if there are no refineries, then they will simply import finished products. And they will do that too. So I think roles for the military, yes. I think if it ever comes to that, they'll first see what else can be done. Oils will be released very noticeably. It will be imported, and even if that doesn't work anymore, which I find a bit hard to imagine, then the supply will get tight. It will collapse. How many euros do you personally put into the channel every day? I'd like some help deciding on my budget. That's a cool question. I can't really answer that directly. I'd have to do some calculations. It changes monthly, usually due to regular expenses. If you're interested, I can just post it on Telegram and pin it at the top, or I can write it in the comments, in the captions, or something like that. Then, or during the next stream or something, I'll bring it to you. That way you'll have something pretty accurate and transparent. If the Ukrainians fire vodka bottles instead of grenades, does that count as chemical warfare? No, it isn't. How will Belarus get involved in this war in any way? By the way, that's the last question. Perfect. It's 10 o'clock. Yes, I don't think so. So I don't think Belarus will attack. I don't think they will get involved in this war or actively escalate it. Because we can see, or especially you can see for yourself, how things are going for Russia. You can see for yourself that Russia hasn't made any progress here for 1,530 days. You can see what sanctions Russia is under, what life is like in Russia. And Lukashenko himself knows that if he were to actively intervene here now with his, in quotation marks, rather small army, first of all, the Ukrainians are prepared here with several lines of defense. And secondly, he wouldn't get very far. And thirdly, he's afraid that Ukraine might invade his country. And fourthly, what he sees happening in Russia, he obviously doesn't want that development for himself. That would likely result in losing power. All right, that's it. So I would say thank you very much for joining us today, as always. Very, 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 very cool. Very cool that we reached the goal. Thank you for the great support, as always. I see comments about the traffic light. The third advent is still a while off. A new fundraising campaign with Ukraine Hilfe Berlin is coming soon, like before. Stay tuned for that. At this point, all I can say is it was great. I enjoyed it again. You saw my dog. He enjoyed it too, until he went inside when someone rang the doorbell. At this point, I want to thank, as always, all subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew. A special big thank you goes to Lieutenant Colonel Renekes, relative Berlin Meyerhofer, who are among the biggest supporters of the channel, at least financially, and whom I also see again and again in the comments. You have all already received your medal. If not, please send me an email. The email is warandtactica@gmail.com. It's also linked in my legal notice. Then I would say, those who donated more than 20 euros today. So anyone who made a donation of more than 20 euros, could you all please send me an email as well, as I said, to
hektik@gmail.com.
the top donation already gets a medal. Again, into the camera, and the other will be handed out randomly. Here, this is about this medal. Then I say, as I said, it was great to have you with us. It was great, it was fun. I hope you'll join us again next time. In the future, we will have our daily situation reports again. Nothing on Saturday. On Sunday, there will be the live stream, except for next Sunday. I'll be away from Sunday to Wednesday, but I do have a few replacement videos for you. Really very, very interesting. Speaking of replacement videos, if we're already on the topic of drones, make sure to watch the video about drone development that I uploaded a few days ago, if you haven't already. It's about Chinese drones. That's almost 100 drones that are launched within 2 minutes, form a drone swarm, can perform multiple tasks simultaneously, and then can prioritize and attack different targets. That's really fascinating. Check it out and feel free to support me on that video. Thank you for listening. Thanks to all subscribers, channel members, especially the ALGE crew, and special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renee Kessler, Dietrich Belli, and Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, and comment. And until the next update,